So now that we have how to quickly set up and call the functions needed to start performing the mount and dismounting operations, we're going to start looking at, in this tutorial, a general idea on how to set up an interaction system. This video is completely optional and is not needed, especially if you have your own interaction system that you're using or want to use. All right, so with that in mind, let's jump in, shall we? Okay, so the first thing we want to do is open up our player controller because that's where a lot of our input systems are going to be kept for this. Bring this open and go here and go to the event class. I'm going to close all of the tabs. Okay, so I've already created an RPC extra graph. I'm going to create another one called input. I like to use these different graphs for overall specialized things such as RPCs and input so that everything's not just cluttering up the event graph. I'll use the event graph for built-in events that are already existing. Anything that requires input or RPC go into these special graphs so I always know exactly where they are and I'm not hunting through my event graph and guessing, is this an RPC? Is this an input? No, it's all right here, separated and good to go. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to create some basic functions that we're going to need. Okay, so for the interaction system, we're going to add a function, and we're going to call this onInteractionPress. We're going to add another one called interact. And then we're going to add one last one called trace for interactable. And then one more called dismount. I have already defined a interface for interacting, and we're going to go there real quick and set that up. So save that, go back here, the BPI interactable actor. Let's open that up. So this interface is only going to have one single function. The more complicated your interaction system is, the more interesting this interface is going to be. I honestly suggest you always create an interface for your interaction system. It just makes interacting with everything very easily and uniformed, and there's no guessing about what's going on. So it's going to have one simple function called interact. And interact is going to have one input. And I like to call this one the instigating actor. For this interaction system, this is usually going to be a controller that's being sent in here, but it could be any kind of actor, and that's why the unified controller pawn interface exists. It was a way that I could easily, no matter what thing my interaction system takes in for interacting with, whether it be the pawn, whether it be a horse, whether it be a controller, I can always get one of those three important actors and trigger them, whether it is AI or the actual player itself. I try not to make assumptions on if I'm dealing with a player controller versus an AI controller. So we're going to make this an actor. There we go. And then we're going to give it a return, a Boolean return, success. This is just a simple way to return that the interaction system has either succeeded or failed. And one of the benefits is that it puts this function on the side. And I like to see them here because I like to put very important functions that need to be implemented over here as opposed to in the not in the event section where you have to go add event, find your interface here if you have anything or your function here. But by adding a return value, it always puts them here. And for me, it's a lot easier to say, okay, I have all these functions that need to be implemented. So that's why all of my functions you will find right here, with an exception of only a few. Okay, so let's go to the interact function, and we're going to give it a parameter. We're going to call it interactable actor. It's going to be of type actor. Okay, so back in the controller, we're going to implement our trace for interactables function. Okay, so basically what we're going to do is we're going to do a line trace within the world based upon where our character is currently looking, kind of like a scan. If that trace hits an interactable actor, which is anything that implements that BPI interactable actor interface, then we're going to store that temporarily. And if we hit the interaction key, which we're going to make our E key, then if we have an interactable actor currently selected, then we're going to trigger the interaction system to start the mounting process. But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go over here and get this flag is mounted. Then we're going to do a branch. So if we're mounted, we're going to do one thing. If we're not mounted, we're going to do something else. So if we're not mounted, we're going to get pawn, our character pawn that we own. Check to make sure it's valid. And if you've set up everything appropriately according to the previous two videos, this should be valid. Then we're going to get the location of our pawn because right now we're the controller, we want the location of our character that we are controlling to determine where the scan is going to be. Get actor location. And then I'm going to add a vector to that. Basically, what get actor location does is if we're walking around as a character type, it has a capsule, and that location is always the center of the capsule, not the foot or not the head. So because of this, I know the magic number that I need to add here to move that location up to about where the eyes are going to be. And that's where we're going to start the scan at. So we get this. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to do get control rotation. So most of the time, your look direction is going to be whatever your controller's rotation is. Kind of an interesting thing that Unreal Engine has done here is that the controller rotation is your viewpoint rotation. So we're going to get this rotation from our controller. Then we're going to do get rotation x vector. We're going to make that into a vector in the forward direction that we are looking. And then we're going to add one more magic number to this. We're going to multiply that by 300 units. So we're getting the forward direction, which is going to be a unit vector. It's only going to be a size of one vector, 1 unit. We're going to take that unit vector and multiply it by 300, making it 300 units long. Then we're going to right click and do line trace by channel. And as long as our character pawn is valid, our start position of the trace is going to be its current location plus 90 units. And its end location, we're going to add get it. So we get the rotation, we get the forward direction of that rotation, we make it 300 units long, and then we add 300 units in the forward direction that we want to the starting location of our actor, or to the current location of our actor. This gives us the end point of our trace. And we're going to do a visibility channel trace with trace complexes off. we're going to ignore some actors. So we're going to do a make array, and then we're going to get the character pawn again, because we want to, whenever we're doing this trace, we're not doing a multi-trace, we're doing a single trace, so we want our own character to be completely ignored for this trace. And then here you can set up some debug information, like you can change the color of the line, you can have it show for 1 frame, you can have it show for a specific duration, you can have it there forever. This is great for debugging. So now that we have the trace going, we're going to branch here. If we hit something, if we have found an actor to hit, then we want to check to see if it's an interactable actor. So I'm going to grab the out hit parameter and I'm going to break it. And then I'm going to grab the hit actor pin and do a function call. The interface function call is mountable pawn. And we want to do the message version. Okay. If we are dealing with a mountable pawn, we want to store that pawn. So now what we're going to do is we're going to store this. And I'm just going to say promote to variable. And we're going to call this hit actor or focused actor. I like that. Focused actor. We're going to set the focused actor. There. So now our interaction function, because it's here, we should give it an output, which I like to do. We're just going to say found actor. That's what we're going to call it. Or better yet, found interactable. And we're going to return true. Because if we got to this part, we have found something to interact with. Copy that, paste it, and then we're going to start bringing in this so that if we fail out somewhere, it all goes to the proper location. We need to bring this down. I like my lines pretty tidy. If we go over here, we're going to have another return false, but we're going to do a bit of a cleanup work here. Okay. So we're going to have a bit of a cleanup work here. So we get to here. For some reason we failed out. We're going to set our focused actor to null, which is what this will do. I'm going to grab these two. I'm going to put them here. So when I get to here, I'm going to then take this get focus actor, and I'm going to convert it to a validated get. And if this is valid, we're going to clear out the focused actor and return no focus actor. So if our character pawn fails, if we fail to get this, then we're going to fail out to here. And if we are currently mounted, we're going to clear our focused actor as well. Sorry, 1 second. Just going to grab that. So if we're currently mounted, then we're just going to make sure that our focused actor is already empty. And then we're just going to bring this over here and bypass this if it's already empty. File and save. Okay, so one quick fix that I just noticed. These wires are crossed. So if we are not mounted, we want to do the trace. If we are mounted, we clear everything out. Just make sure everything's nice and tidy. All right, so that concludes our trace for interactable. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is set up our RPCs so that we can send our interaction request to the server. Now I'm going to take this and open it up. This is my RPC graph, and I'm going to have 3 functions here. 3 custom functions. So we're going to add custom event, add event, and I'm going to call this server interact. And this is going to be a run on server function that is going to be reliable. I'm just going to copy this. Double click it or just edit it over here. This is going to be called server dismount. So we have server interact, server dismount, and server possess, which we've already set up earlier. So server dismount also needs to be run on server and reliable. Okay, so with our basic functions set up, we can now start adding parameters to these RPCs. The dismount is pretty straightforward. All we're going to do is call dismount while on the server. The server interact function is going to call interact, but we're going to take this and make it a parameter for this server function. I really like doing it this way just because now that I have these functions set up, I can easily add and remove the same parameters from the event RPC calls. Okay, so the next thing we're going to set up is our inputs. And for this, it's going to be really simple. I'm going to press E key. And all this is going to do is call our function on interaction pressed. All right, so the E key is pressed. It triggers off on interaction pressed. And this is going to be the next function we set up. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is on interaction pressed. This button is what handles our input system. So on interaction gets activated whenever the E key is hit. And the first thing we want to know is, are we currently mounted? In this very simple interaction system, if we are not mounted, we want to see if there's something that we can mount and mount it. Otherwise, if we already are mounted, then we want to dismount. So, first thing to do, grab this focus actor, get, and we're going to check to see if it's valid. If it's valid, we're going to call our function interact and supply it our focused actor. And then our interaction pressed is going to return if this action is successful or not. It's going to be return a Boolean value. And in this case, it will be successful. So if we don't have a valid focused actor, we're going to return false. Or if we are currently mounted, we want to call our dismount function. And then we will also return true. One last thing here. Apparently my dyslexia has been kicking in for this tutorial. So on the on interaction pressed button, we need to swap these so that if we're mounted, if we are mounted is true, we go to dismount. If we are not mounted or is mounted is false. then we try to mount something instead of vice versa, like we had it. Okay, so the next thing we're going to set up is our interaction function. Like all the others, this is pretty straightforward. The first thing we're going to do is, once again, is valid. Then we're going to see if we currently are the authority, which is usually the server, or in a standalone game, it's just your character, the current game. If we have authority, then we're going to call interact, but we're going to call the interface function for interact. And part of this function's arguments, we're going to send in the controller itself. So you want to get a reference to self. Okay. If we are not the authority, that means we are a client that is connected to a server. We want to call the server version of interact. So we're going to send this request to the server to say, hey, I want to start mounting this fellow. And then we're going to supply the mount, which is sent into this function, to here. So now, when this hits the server is going to have a reference to that mount that's replicated up from the client. And then it's going to call the same interaction function on the server that was called on the client, except this time, because now the server's the authority, it's going to call the actual interaction interface function for the mount. A part of this video, we're going to see how this interaction function then triggers the controller to start the mounting process. Okay, so the last function we're going to look at is dismount. Dismount's going to work very similar to how interaction works. The only difference is that our controller, being the key interaction part of this, is going to trigger it off. So the first thing we're going to do is check for authority. Then we're going to get our mount, get character mount, and we're going to make sure that it's valid on the authority. Always check to make sure it's valid. If you're working in a team, you never know if someone has set something up wrong or what's happened. So just always check if it's valid. In this case, send yourself a message, say, hey, dummy, you forgot to set this up right. Something silly like that. So you go back and fix it. For the most part, we're not going to worry too much about this because I've done this 100 times. But now from the character mount, we're going to call prepare to dismount. We're going to call the controller's function of prepare to dismount, and we're going to send in our mount, as long as it's valid, into the prepare to dismount. And then we're also going to return if this was successful or not. So in this case, we just connect the dots. All right. So if we're not on the authority, then we need to go to the server and tell it, hey, I want to dismount. So you grab that, grab the remote. I like to keep my strings somewhat straight. And then we're going to apply this. And whether or not this returns success for this or not is completely up to you and your own interaction system. But I return false for this. I actually have a much more complicated interaction system that I've designed that accounts for these sending to the servers and back, but we're not building that. This is a very simple interaction system. you can set that up and figure that out for yourselves. All right, so that's it for dismount. Okay, so the very last thing we're going to do on the controller, or at least one of the very last things we're going to do on the controller, is make sure that it is calling this trace for interactable. And this is, for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to drag this out and connect it so that on tick, we are just constantly tracing to see if we have something we can interact with. In a production system, you don't want to do this. You want it to be more like a client-only thing to see if they're interacting, and then you want to validate on the server that you can interact with this object by checking the distances and the rotations and things like that. That way, you're not overloading the server constantly, especially if it's a very large multiplayer game where you're dealing with several players who are running around scanning and tracing for things. While tracing is fairly quick in Unreal Engine, you can overload the system eventually. So I like to do things, if it's not overly critical. I like to only do things that are on the client and then validate that they are a valid thing to do on the server. So with that, this is basically going to start our basic running around and trying to interact with things. Okay, so the last thing we're going to need for our trace is set up our collision settings. So go to Edit, Project Settings. And then over here under Engine, you're going to have Collision. We're going to chase some presets here. You don't have to do it this way, but this is how I've chosen to do it. It seems to work out for all of my own personal projects. But you can set this up differently or do things differently, however you want. The first thing I'm going to do is turn off collision for both visibility and camera for pawn objects. The pawn object is actually just the capsule around your character. So if I were to open up my character here, this capsule here is actually what is set up to the pawn collision preset. And then my mesh object is set to character mesh. And this is the one that we are actually interested in for our horse and for interacting with other characters. So we're going to go back to the settings, our collision, and then we're going to open up our character mesh. And we're essentially going to swap the visibility and the camera trace for this. So now the camera trace is going to ignore our character mesh, but our visibility trace is going to be blocked. So accept that. All right, and that's it for setting up the collision for this. Okay, so the last little bit of this is we're going to go and set up our horse for interaction. So open up the horse. The first thing we need is to put, just to make sure, we're going to put our interaction interface, PI, interactable actor. So open this up and we're going to implement our interaction. Basically, our horse determines, our interactable actors in my system kind of determine how they're interact with. So if this was like an inventory item, it would basically tell the controller, pick me up. In this case, it's a horse, so it says, mount me. Any other thing could trigger off some other action that causes the world to change or something along those lines. But for this particular system, our only interaction is just mounting and dismounting a horse. So the first thing I want to do is ensure that I have the character controller. From the horse's perspective, it doesn't know what this is because interacting actor is just an actor, a random actor. So what we're going to do is on that is call get character controller. Now, I know as a programmer that what I sent in here when I built this system was the controller. But my horse doesn't know that. So that's why the unified controller pawn interface always has a way to kind of ensure that the object that I want is the object that I need. So I call get character controller on this to make sure someone didn't send in something silly. Or if they did, this function is going to return null. Okay, so is valid. And then if that's valid, we're going to call get character pawn, because we're going to need the pawn in a minute for a different reason. And then we're also going to call is valid on that. We need the controller and the pawn eventually, just to make sure that this is a valid system. So with these two things out of the way, I'm going to call can mount pawn. This basically just indicates and tells our system if this horse / vehicle is in a state that can allow another character to mount it, then yes, go ahead and do so. For instance, we might not have any more available seating. Or our wild bronco might not be tamed, so it'll not accept new riders. So if this passes, then what I want to do is check to see if my rider, our potential new rider, is an acceptable pawn to mount. To perform mounting. There might be reasons why our pawn cannot mount this vehicle or horse. Maybe the horse doesn't like him. Maybe he's not the horse's owner. World is your oyster. Okay, so if we now get past the is mountable by pawn stage, we're going to call prepare to mount on our controller. All right. And now we just need to tidy everything up. And we want to return false if this fails for whatever reason. And we have quite a few possible reasons for this to fail. For one being, this mount can't mount this horse. This mount no longer has enough seating. We couldn't get our pawn, or we could not get our controller for whatever reason. In that case, our entire mounting has failed. All right, and that is it for setting up the interaction system that we'll be using, or would be using. Now, should you press play, you should have a fully functional mounting and dismounting system on your hands. There's a few other things that we cover in later videos, such as adding animations to get on and off, as well as how to set up the system in order to move your character forward and into position for mounting. And those come in later videos. So if you have some time, I suggest checking those out, and they are linked in the description below. Thank you for watching. Adios.